both Islamic and Latin commercial frameworks simultaneously. The trading cities of southern Spain, in the decades before and after the Reconquista, were full of Arabic-speaking merchants whose contracts had to be translated into Latin for local courts, and whose instruments followed them in translation. The Italian city-states didn't invent the bill of exchange. They inherited it, adapted it, and eventually dominated the system it operated within. That's not a diminishment of their contribution. Adaptation is its own form of innovation. But attribution matters if we want to understand how financial systems actually develop, not through individual genius, but through absorption, iteration, and the slow movement of commercial practice across political boundaries. The structural collapse came in 1258. The Mongol sack of Baghdad didn't just destroy a city, it severed the administrative and commercial spine of the most integrated trade network the medieval world had produced. The House of Wisdom, which had functioned as both an intellectual center and a nexus of commercial correspondence, was gone. The canal systems that made Mesopotamian agriculture viable were destroyed and never fully rebuilt. The trade routes that had connected the caliphate's eastern and western peripheries were broken, rerouted, or made too dangerous to operate. The Hawala networks didn't disappear, they contracted. The merchant courts that enforced commercial agreements lost jurisdictional coherence. The system didn't collapse overnight, but the infrastructure that had sustained it was fatally compromised. What survived migrated. Merchants, scholars, and legal traditions moved to Cairo, to Samarkand, to the Ottoman territories that would consolidate in the 14th and 15th centuries. The instruments traveled with them. And some portion of that practice, filtered through Sicilian traders and Spanish translators and Genoese intermediaries, became the foundation on which the European commercial revolution would build. So it wasn't really about religion versus commerce. It wasn't about East versus West, or modernity versus tradition. What this period reveals is a pattern that financial history repeats without acknowledgement. Sophisticated commercial infrastructure develops where commercial problems are most complex, migrates along trade routes to where capital is most concentrated, gets absorbed by new institutional contexts, and loses its attribution in the process. The Italian city-states didn't hide their debt to Islamic commercial law. They simply stopped referencing it once they'd surpassed it. The system doesn't care about credit, it cares about function. And the most important question isn't which civilization invented modern finance. It's why we keep telling the story as if one did. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. The standard timeline of financial history has a gap in it, roughly 6 centuries wide, and almost nobody talks about it. Every survey of how modern money works will take you from Roman trade networks to the Italian city-states, from Venice's Calaganza contracts to Amsterdam's joint stock companies, and the story feels complete, logical, progressive. What that timeline omits is an entire civilization that had already worked out most of those mechanisms before Italian merchants had even coined the word banco. Welcome to the Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. The gap runs from roughly the 7th century to the 13th. It covers the Umayyad expansion across 3 continents, the Abbasid consolidation of the known trade world, and the emergence of financial instruments that won't appear in European practice for another 200 to 400 years. The gap isn't an oversight. It's the result of a particular way of telling financial history, one that begins in Europe, ends in Europe, and treats everything that happened in between as context rather than content. That framing has consequences. By the 9th century, a merchant in Baghdad could transfer funds to a trading partner in Cairo without touching a single coin. The instrument was called a hawala, essentially a trust-based remittance network operating through a web of brokers who settled debts against each other rather than moving currency across dangerous roads. You gave your funds to a broker in Baghdad. He wrote you a note. You carried the note to Cairo, handed it to his counterpart, and received the equivalent sum. The physical money never moved. The obligation did. This isn't a primitive ancestor of modern wire transfer. It is wire transfer, minus the electricity. The hawala system worked because it ran on something more reliable than gold: reputation. Brokers who defaulted on obligations were excluded from networks that spanned from Cordoba to Samarkand to the Malabar coast. The enforcement mechanism wasn't a court. It was social and commercial extinction. And it worked for centuries across a territory that would have required multiple armies and constant political negotiation for any European state to even approach. What made this possible wasn't just geography, though the geography helped. The Abbasid Caliphate sat at the intersection of 3 continents and controlled the overland and maritime routes between them. What made it work structurally was a unified legal framework, specifically the development of fiqh, al-muamalat, Islamic commercial jurisprudence, which created consistent rules for contracts across jurisdictions that otherwise shared nothing except the direction of prayer. A merchant in Basra and a merchant in Tunis could enter into a legally recognized commercial agreement because the underlying contract law was the same. Rome had achieved something similar for a shorter period over a smaller geography. No one else had. Now here's where the conventional framing tends to go wrong. The prohibition on riba, charging interest on loans, is usually described as a constraint on Islamic commerce. The argument goes, without interest-bearing debt, how could sophisticated finance develop? That assumption has it exactly backwards. Prohibition doesn't eliminate demand, it redirects it. What the riba prohibition created was an entire parallel architecture of financial instruments designed to achieve the economic function of interest without the legal form of it. The mudaraba contract, documented in Islamic legal texts by the 8th century, is the cleanest example. One party provides capital, another provides labor and expertise. Profits are split according to a pre-agreed ratio. Losses fall on the capital provider, not the working partner. Strip out the theological framing, and what you're looking at is a venture capital arrangement. Risk sharing, performance-linked returns, liability allocated to the party best positioned to absorb it. The musharaka is a partnership equity structure. The ijara is a lease financing instrument. The suftaja is a bill of exchange, a written promise of future payment that could be traded between merchants before the payment was due, effectively creating a secondary market in commercial paper. European historians date the bill of exchange to the Italian city-states of the 12th and 13th centuries. The Arabic suftaja predates this by at least 300 years. This isn't a question of which civilization was smarter. It's a structural observation. The institutions that produce sophisticated financial instruments are the institutions that have the most complex commercial problems to solve. The Abbasid economy, at its peak in the 10th century, may have been the largest single commercial zone on Earth. Complex problems generate complex solutions. That's how systems work. The Waqf deserves its own mention because it represents something genuinely without European precedent at the time of its development. The Waqf was an endowment, a portion of property or capital dedicated to a specific charitable or public purpose, administered in perpetuity by a trustee, and legally insulated from seizure by the state or heirs. Mosques ran on Waqf funds. So did hospitals, schools, libraries, and urban water systems. The institution created a category of assets that existed outside both private property and government control. What this meant economically was a mechanism for accumulating and deploying capital across generations without the disruptions of inheritance, political seizure, or dynastic collapse. The closest European analog, the trust, doesn't appear in English common law until the 15th century. The Waqf had been functioning for 600 years before that. Notice what happens next. Starting in the 11th century, the commercial logic of the Islamic world begins migrating westward through a series of contact points that European history tends to treat as military events rather than economic ones. The Crusades were, among other things, a sustained exposure of European merchants to more sophisticated commercial infrastructure. Sicily under Norman rule was trilingual, Arabic, Greek, Latin, and its merchant class operated in